Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar, which is a part of the series With Hearts and Hands. This webinar will continue the discussion on dementia caregiving. Today, we're specifically focusing on a peculiar kind of grief. My name is Krishna Dalakia, and I'm the Senior Health Education Specialist at the Church Pension Group. I'm responsible for developing content and curriculum for health and wellness courses, presentations, and conferences. I'm also the host of the CPG podcast, Choose Well. Today, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Jean Denton, who will be facilitating our webinar. After a long career in nursing education and healthcare administration, Jean was ordained as a deacon, focusing her service on parish-based health ministry. She was able to bring together her work in the church with her lifelong work in healthcare and founded National Episcopal Health Ministries and served on the faculty of Credo. Later ordained as a priest, she served as senior associate rector at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Indianapolis. Jean left her full-time parish ministry to be present with her husband, who had completed his 13-year struggle with younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Now retired, Jean lives in Claremont, California. She periodically serves as chaplain at Gladstone's Library in Wales. She is also the writer of Walking Each Other Home, Spiritual Companionship for Dementia Caregivers, which will be offered by Church Publishing this fall. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jean.
Hello. Thank you very much, Krishna. I think I'm on. We'll see what happens. But thank you, Krishna. And thank everybody who's been behind the scenes making this work, Cindy and many others. I don't bring myself here as an expert on grief. What I do is say I have walked the walk, and I'm going to be conversing with some other panelists who are also walking the walk of dementia grief. I'm glad each of you is here for this conversation. As to format, I'll start by sharing some ideas with a PowerPoint presentation, and then panelists and I will be doing some talking, conversing, and then we'll open things up for your questions in the chat box. I wish we could answer everybody's question on everything relating to dementia. Obviously, we can't, and certainly not addressing things like medical diagnoses and insurance issues, but we are very open to talking about your sorrow and what dementia caregiving has meant to that. So I'm going to share my screen. And it's this one, and I'm going to share, and we're going to do it from the beginning, I hope. There we go. Okay. Certainly the kind of grief that dementia caregivers experience is a peculiar kind of grief. It's kind of distinct from others. Denise Levertov is one of my favorite poets. She says, "To speak of sorrow works on it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall." So today we are going to take some of Levertov's fine wisdom, and we'll be focusing specifically on 4 areas. One is sharing some common understandings about grief. It's a big topic, just a few common understandings. And then we'll be focusing in on grief, both in dementia, but mostly grief in dementia caregiving. We'll spend some time on depression and dementia grief, and then hopefully spending a lot of time on how we can be present with our grief. That's our arrangement for this time together. So how about some common understandings about grief? Well, here are some. One is that grief is natural. It's uncontrollable. It's like grief happens. You don't get to choose when or where it's going to pop up. You could try to stuff it away, but somehow it will continue to show itself. It has a life of its own. Secondly, if you grieve, it means you have loved. Grieving means suffering. We don't much like suffering, and maybe that's why we avoid talking about grief. But I hope that you can remember that if you are grieving, it is because you've had something so special, because you have loved. Another point, the more significant the loss, the more intense the grief. That sounds pretty logical. Only you can define what significant loss means for you. My husband, Tom, when he lost his ability to keep score at our Scrabble games, it was a loss. But when he couldn't walk upstairs anymore, that was a significant loss for me. We've each got our own definition of what significant means. New losses recall old losses. Wouldn't it be great if we could grieve something, tie it up in a bow, put it on the back shelf in the closet and forget about it? We can't, because every new loss recalls old loss. That's hard, but I think there's some real benefit in it, because I think grief helps form who we are. If we can integrate it, we will have grown. It helps form us. And then lastly, in general terms, grief is multifaceted. It's what's called a cluster emotion. Grief doesn't come all by itself. It brings with it other things. It's a conglomerate. We might feel some guilt while we're feeling grief, guilt over some unrealistic expectations we may have had of ourselves, or we may feel some resentment or some anger. We might also feel some regret of things done or left undone. But grief is multifaceted and it's very complicated. So what about grief in dementia and in dementia caregiving? You've got two griefs that you get to navigate somehow when you're a dementia caregiver. The grief that your loved one is going through, their own experience as well as your own. So for just a moment on the grief that your loved one may be going through, it might be called a more classic grief. We're often reminded of Kubler-Ross's stages of facing grief. And you might see these things showing up in your loved one. I would remind you that these are not sequential. They cycle, they recycle, but they do show up kind of on their own sometimes. You might be seeing your loved one being in denial. That might express itself with words like, oh, the diagnosis is wrong, or, well, this is temporary. I'm going to get through this. I'll be better soon. Or some excuses maybe for trying to normalize problematic behaviors. It all speaks to denial, and that's a legitimate place to be when you're in denial. Another stage might be anger, and that's going to get expressed maybe by your loved one's frustration at being unable to function as before. Or maybe it gets expressed as resenting your attempts to be a caregiver. Anger, legitimate, it's there. Bargaining, oh, that magical thinking that we all engage in sometime. If I do this, then such and such will happen. Maybe it's a mind game. And again, it's a space in our grieving that holds us for a little while Another step is depression, that place where sad reality really sets in and we recognize that something's unavoidable. Tears certainly go with that. And if we're lucky, we get to another place, at least for a while, called acceptance, saying and really meaning that what is real, that we can't change it, that we have to find ways to cope with it. Well, so much for kind of classic grief. What about the grief of dementia caregivers? I'm going to share with you 4 descriptive terms, and they help me kind of step back from sadness and look at it in a bigger context. The first is anticipatory grief. It is a set of complex feelings experienced while anticipating an inevitable death ahead. Of course, when you get a diagnosis of dementia, you start grieving. But your life really hasn't changed from what it was 5 minutes ago. You look ahead, you imagine the death of your loved one, you imagine all the losses that are going to come along the way. There's a lot to mourn. Anticipatory grief is normal. But I would give you a caveat here to say, use my mother's wisdom. She would say, Jean, don't borrow trouble. And I bring that up simply to say, you can't grieve all the grief that you're going to be feeling at one point. You've got to stay in the present. Don't get caught up in all the what ifs or, oh, what's next? Or how am I going to handle it if? There's enough sadness in the moment to stay in the present. Don't borrow trouble. Anticipatory grief is real, but it does not have to dominate your life. A second phrase, chronic sorrow. Chronic sorrow is a set of pervasive, profound, continuing, and recurring grief responses resulting from a significant loss or absence of crucial aspects of another living person to whom there is deep attachment. Susan Roos has talked about this in her book, Chronic Sorrow, and she comes from a perspective of a parent of a child who has congenital difficulties. Every day, she's aware that, gee, 2-year-old should be, but mine isn't. She says that chronic sorrow is permanent. Says it really can't be fixed. It has to be dealt with differently. It's the ongoing disparity between the anticipated normal. We were supposed to be going on a cruise and enjoying our retirement, for example. The disparity between that anticipated normal and the reality of what you face day by day, it is indeed a living loss. The third phrase I'd like to share is that of disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised. It's a grief that is a hidden sorrow that refers to any grief that goes unacknowledged or unvalidated by social norms. The idea that society has norms of grief is not one we often think about, but consider it. If you work for an organization that has policies on bereavement, let's say, you get a certain number of days if your spouse dies, time off to grieve. Well, what if it's your mother who dies? Is it a different number? What is it if it's your best friend? I don't think you get time off for that. My point here is that there are many, many losses experienced that are not seen by other people, and therefore other people minimize them. I don't fault people for this, but I'm saying that it's quite real. With disenfranchised grief, there is no ritual that puts a period after things. There's no burial service. There's no gathering of friends after a divorce is finalized. It's living in a world that has expectation that life will just go on as normal. I want to spend a little bit of time on this disenfranchised grief, looking at something that Jude Weir had worked on. She is a therapist who works specifically with dementia caregivers. She says that psychological losses associated with dementia caregiving are not recognized as losses worthy of grief. What a phrase. What is worthy of grief? What is significant? If society doesn't see it, somehow society says it doesn't exist. A second thing she points out is that the erosion of the relationship between the caregiver and the loved one with dementia means that there's no one who gets it. If you've got a close relationship and you've had a lot of give and take and you've been able to emotionally relate to each other, when that starts to go, you lose your partner there. There is no one who really understands it. You're in it alone. And then this is something that I've got as a soapbox, I suppose. Stigma, shame, and secrecy are still associated with dementia. We know that brain disease is stigmatized, even if kidney disease and heart disease are not. We get sympathy with those last two. With the first, there is still some shame. And again, I call us to speaking our reality to the world for two reasons. One, the world needs to know what's really going on. This is no secret. And secondly, I think if we don't share, we wind up selling our souls, and we're losing enough. Let's not lose our souls too. The fourth category is that of ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss occurs when a person is physically present, but psychologically absent, as in somebody with advanced dementia, or someone is psychologically present, but physically absent, as in with prisoners of war, for example. The relationship that you had with this other person is ruptured. There is therefore, because it's ambiguous, there is no opportunity for closure. It's gone. This relationship is gone, but it's really not gone. I put the name, I hope you can see it in large print down there, Pauline Boss. She is the social worker who coined the phrase ambiguous loss, wrote a book by that name, and also a book called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. I would strongly encourage you, if this is an issue in your world, your life, to take a look at that book. She's quite brilliant, I think. Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. Well, what about depression and dementia grief? I'm going to share some numbers with you, not to try to scare you and not to try to say, oh, this is going to happen to you. Who knows if it's going to happen or not, or if it has happened. I share it only to do some forewarning, some saying that this might happen, and to get you thinking about what some possibilities are for how you might handle it if it does happen. This is from research. It's a 2021 Alzheimer's Disease Facts and Figures by the Alzheimer's Association. Approximately 40% of dementia caregivers suffer from depression, compared with age mates, and compared actually also with people who are long-term caregivers of folks who've got other ailments like stroke or schizophrenia. There's a lot of depression with dementia caregiving. Numbers, we could argue the accuracy of them, but just know that there's a lot of it. It's a very hard job, and we're asked to overfunction. Secondly, note that the rates of depression, how much a person is feeling as a caregiver, increases with two things. One, with the severity of the cognitive impairment. So when the disease increases and demands more of the caregiver, more time, more energy, more focus, there's more depression. The rate also increases with the lack of reciprocity in the relationship. I mentioned earlier that give and take that you're used to having with somebody, that mutuality of experience. As that goes, depression increases as well. And then a third point, there is more depression near the time of nursing home placement and 6 months following. There's relief, certainly a certain level of relief that happens when you as a caregiver are not doing the 24-hour physical care and everything else. There's some relief with that, but don't expect it to be just relief, because there is more depression around this time. It may come because we've got some inappropriate guilt related to our ability to handle anything, and that can fan depression. So I just, again, raise this so that you might be forewarned. If it happens, it happens. So what do we do with this? I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just maybe sharing some of my experience and some wisdom lived. Get some medical attention, some psychotherapeutic help if you think that you might be depressed. There is help out there. You are not alone. Remember that you don't get any extra stars in your heavenly crown because you suffer more. There's little to be gained from unnecessary suffering. And then I would encourage you to talk with your healthcare professional about whether or not medication might help you as you incorporate new coping strategies and insights. Medicine's not going to help everybody. You're in a unique situation where you are constantly being asked to overfunction, but maybe medication could help you as you learn new habits, as you get new ways of moving ahead. So, how do we be present with our grief? There's help out there for this too. I'm going to point up some that I know of. One is from our faith traditions. These thoughts come from Aileen Barclay. She is a pastoral theologian at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Her husband, Peter, lived with Alzheimer's disease, and she writes clearly about it in this lament with Psalm 88. There are lament psalms. Jeremiah certainly laments. And Aileen says that to mourn and to weep is a faithful response. Being sad isn't wrong. Even in religious traditions, you don't have to be happy. To be sad means that you've got a relationship with the other, with God. Stick with it. She says, too, the lament is a way that she was able to continue her grievances, and she had them, without destroying herself. She also talks about her church friends, maybe work friends too. She said she wants friends who can be present without having the need to fix things that cannot be fixed this side of the kingdom. There's advice also from psychologists, and I just raise one up. Susan David is a PhD who works at the Harvard Medical School. She has a fascinating episode in a podcast, ttfa.org. TTFA stands for terrible, thanks for asking. We could go into that at another point, but in her session on what's negative about positivity, she says, that we live in a society that really parades toxic positivity, that we know what to do when somebody's happy. We want people to be happy. It's almost the American way, but it can be toxic if it excludes reality, if it excludes the uncomfortable feelings that people naturally have. She applauds all feelings as being legitimate. They may not be comfortable, but they're legitimate. She says in praise of hard emotions that they signpost our values. They tell us what matters to us. And what matters to us, what we value, is indeed positive. She goes on to speak about the need to be more emotionally literate. If we can improve our emotional literacy, we can name more precisely what our underlying feelings are. Let me go through one kind of example there. You might say, I feel bereft. David would say, that's right, you feel bereft. You are not bereft. You have a feeling. You are more than that one feeling. What does it signpost for you? Maybe it signposts that I value the love that we used to share. And from that, you go to, that was special. That was precious. That is definitely worth treasuring. You might want to spend some time doing some remembering there. You might want to remember too that even though you can't cure an illness, you can still care and express that love. There's advice from the Alzheimer's Association too, and I can't speak highly enough of alz.org, the Alzheimer's Association website. It's not just Alzheimer's, it's all kinds of dementias. And they suggest, I think, some very practical things. Face your feelings. Experience all of your feelings, the positive, the negative, and let yourself be as sad as you are. It's all quite natural. Then prepare to experience feelings of loss more than once. We talked about Kubler-Ross's stages being cyclical. It happens here too. You're not going to be done with a certain grief. It's going to come back again. Deal with it when it comes, not before. Then claim the grieving process as your own. It's like a fingerprint. You're the only one who grieves the way you do. Don't compare yourself to anybody else. There's no right or wrong. There's no perfect grieving. There's your way. And then talk to somebody. I don't know who that somebody would be. It might be your support group. It might be your clergy. It might be a spiritual director. It might be a very good friend. David Kessler is a therapist who works with grief a lot, and he says, no matter how we grieve, we share the need to have our grief witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of loss without trying to point to the silver lining. Another point Alzheimer's Association makes is that we can indeed address our feelings of isolation and loneliness. They're part of the show, but maybe we don't have to feel them constantly, totally. Could we take some time out? Could we experience something else, be with somebody else, find someone to be with our loved one so that we can recognize the rest of who we are? Then know that some people may not understand your grief. That's not a judgment. People aren't bad because they don't get it. They just can't get it. They have not walked in your shoes. And lastly, accept yourself. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But I think when we know ourselves to be simply mortal human beings, not messiahs, we can accept ourselves better. And I close this PowerPoint with some wisdom from Henri Nouwen. No final healing is likely to come from analyzing your wounds. You need to let your wounds go down into your heart. Then you will live them through and discover that they will not destroy you. Your heart is greater than your wounds. Your heart is greater than your wounds. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to ask for our panelists to please, if I get the guests, our panelists to please unmute yourself. That would be Emily and Butch. And I'm going to ask you to also put on your video. I think Butch is coming.
I'm trying.
Oh, good. We like, there you go, thanks. Emily is a very civic-minded clergy spouse. She's worked in commercial real estate, project management. Butch is a pastor emeritus of a very large congregation where he served as the senior minister for 20 years. He hails from Texas. He has studied there and in the East. He loves books and ideas and humor. So I'm going to ask some questions of you folks. Butch, when we talked recently, you shared with me that you and your loved one had a breakthrough in talking about dementia, and I found that a poignant story. Could you share that with our listeners?
Yes, I'd be glad to. Let me say first that I want to plead a textbook case for the presentation that you have just made, Jean, and to say how helpful it was. You'll ask about tears maybe later. That presentation brought tears to my eyes because it touched my journey. My love denial for.
Okay, so you were frozen. You were frozen for a little bit, and I think that we also lost a bit of Emily's introduction.
Yes.
So just if you could continue, I just wanted to let you know. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll do my very best here, folks. I'm no pro at this. The Emily introduction, I think was worth repeating if it didn't get through. She describes herself as the chief logistics officer responsible for managing a life and home turned upside down by dementia. I think that was well put. Emily, I want to focus on you just a little bit here. I'm wondering how you are managing your grief. And I say that you've got a younger onset dementia that you are dealing with. It's a different story. How are you coping?
One of the hardest things about the grief of someone with early onset is they don't fit the picture of dementia, and so often people will just not believe it, and that makes the caregivers' grief a little harder because people are really saying, this, I don't see it, and therefore you think, well, maybe I'm imagining this thing, so that makes it harder.
Yeah, I bet it would. It would. And again, because you're dealing with this at kind of a younger stage, you've had a career. You and your loved one would be in the midst of your careers at this point, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, and we are lucky that she has a pension, and we are lucky that we can draw on that and on disability. So we are luckier than a lot of people.
Yeah.
But there are some plans and dreams that just had to be set aside. Mm-hmm.
The future, the hoped for future. I don't know if Butch is back with us.
I'm here, but I cannot make the video come back. I'm sorry. Once it froze, that was it.
We're
but I
having,
can hear you and see you.
okay, thanks. Butch, I'm going to ask you, even if we can't see you, to say something about how you use humor. I know humor is with life in general, and those of us who know you have appreciated that. But how does humor work when it's a dementia? Does it help you get through?
I look for ways constantly, no matter how silly or simple they are, to laugh together. And whenever that happens, there is a connection. I somehow had to take the watch off to be charged, so that about every 3 days I do that. And I put it somewhere I could not find it. Well, there was some self-deprecating humor that I could share with her. And we had the best laugh for a while. And that's happened in several other instances where it was my faux pas that opened some wonderful connection in her heart and soul. Because I have to confess that I'm not a non-dominant personality. Uh, and so when I make a mistake like that, I think it brings me into her world in a new way, and also sees me in a light she may have always wanted to see me. Less of the guy that's in charge and knows it all and is a senior pastor and that sort of thing. So humor has worked really, really well. And when I laugh at myself, which I try to do a lot, she enjoys that. And it's been a blessing.
I think I hear you saying too that you can laugh at your own imperfection, because perfection in caregiving I don't think exists. And if we can start to take ourselves a little less seriously, maybe we would have a little less sadness too.
Well, I hope so. I have never been involved in anything where I thought I was going to be so effective. As a clergy person, as a pastor who for nearly 50 years walked the road of grief with so many people, I thought I knew it all. What I found out is that I don't know it, that I'm vulnerable, that it's trial and error. And most of all, I've learned that, particularly with her dementia, there's a surprise every day.
Yeah.
Every day there is a surprise. I can predict, I think this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to work out. This is what I need to do. I have to set that all aside and wait to be vulnerable to a certain kind of spontaneity.
It's quite humbling, to be sure.
Wow.
Emily, I want to, it's good. Emily, I wanted to move over to depression. I experienced depression.
I think I can probably run with that.
Yes, I think that's a great idea.
So I think Jean and I had a discussion yesterday about depression and caregiving, which do go hand in hand. But if I have firsthand lifelong experience with depression, and I feel like there's a difference between depression and grief, and that having the self-understanding to know when what you're dealing with is your depression and what you're dealing with is your sadness is helpful. And that that's something that I've worked on for many years with a therapist. But to really say, you know, the depression, when you feel like you're down at the bottom of the well and there is no ladder to get out, is a little different from just this thing keeps running me over, and I have to get up and dust myself off and do it again. So there's a difference in those two things, but at the same time, they both are things with which it's helpful to have someone else give you and someone, you know, professional, give you some help and advice on that.
I'm going to ask about being helpful. I think that some of the comments that Aileen Barclay said about she wants friends who don't have to fix things. We need help as caregivers. We are going through horrible times that need some witness. Sometimes people want to help and it's helpful. Sometimes people want to help and it's not. Could either of you say something about how you have been helped, have asked for help, have not wanted help?
I'm afraid, can you hear us, Jean? Okay.
Now I can hear you, Butch.
Okay. I'm saying the helping hand strikes again syndrome bothers me because I think there's an assumption out there.
So Emily, would you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I really want to hear what he had to say about that.
I know.
I guess so. People like to help, but there are people for whom it helps if you know what kind of help you want. Sometimes I say to people, make a list of things that you need done, and then when someone says, "Can I help?" you can say, "Yes." As a matter of fact, could you find someone who could rake the leaves in my yard? I'll pay for it or whatever, but could you just arrange for that to happen? Or you could say, could you make us a dinner that's not lasagna? And so having a list helps. And then there is another thing though, which is that there are people who, and they're often found in churches who really need to be needed. And so you have to be able to say, no, I don't need your help right now, and say it as gently as you can, but um, try to get a sense of being able to accept help from the people who can really be helpful, and then give them some direction on how to be helpful.
And I think it's 2:47, so we'll get into the Q&A section of this. And I just wanted to thank everyone. I know that it's pretty stressful when there are technology issues and you're facilitating a conversation. So I think we can all just take a deep breath, and these things just happen. And it's a part of being resilient, which is what we're kind of talking about right now. So I wanted to just share some comments that have come in. Please, I want to encourage you to enter in your questions in the little time that we have, and we'll do our best to answer them. And so the first thing that kind of really struck me was a comment that came in. It's really helpful to remember that the loved one is grieving too, not just the caregiver. And I know you mentioned that while you were talking. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Well, I'll start and just say, you're trying to navigate two kinds of grieving. It's tough. It's tough not to get soaked into one to the exclusion of the other. I think we need to be alert to so much, and to be alert to what's inside as well as to the one who's next to us. Any wisdom, Emily or Butch?
I totally agree with what you just said. I find sometimes that I will burst out in tears at the strangest times. And I finally have understood that it's her expression of grief. And I supposed it was there, but it didn't really start until after we had the acknowledgement between the two of us that she has dementia. Then she was able to have these bursts of tears. It's very helpful to me, and I think to her as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'll just continue on because someone else put in just to thread along with this conversation, which I think applies here. I'm afraid to even walk into an experience of grieving because I'm afraid I won't be able to be present every moment the best I can be. My mother feeds off from my state of being, and I feel I always have to be positive for her. I don't know what will trigger her into episodes where she gets very upset, angry, and hopeless. I feel like I'm always waiting for the shoe to drop and for her to spin out.
What a place to have to live. What a place. I wish I had a tidy answer for that. One response I would have is that maybe there's a way to make place for our grief. Now, my therapist suggested I do this, and it was a certain time. It was my time. I could rant and rave. I could write. I could cry. I could do what I needed to do. And it was not with my husband. It was by myself. But at least it was a way of expressing it. I think the person who asked the question is right on target with a lot, but also with saying that the caregiver's mood and affect and ability to be even and holding it together strongly influences the loved one's response. That's an awfully heavy burden if there is no outlet to be real to yourself. So I guess that's what I would say. Make sure you've got a place where you know you can be real and not have to deny yourself.
Yeah.
What would you say about being real with the person you're giving care? In other words, I find myself, when she breaks down and cries, I cry. Is that appropriate?
I have no answer to whether it's appropriate or not. If it is something that feels therapeutic on some level, because you are connecting on an emotional
Yes.
level, you're together, that can be bittersweet, and it can be absolutely beautiful. If being upset is something that is going to trigger behaviors that spin way out of control with your loved one, then you're going to look at it differently. Emily, you have any wisdom on this? You've lived a lot.
I think the first thing that struck me is I try not to hold yourself to a higher standard. Try not to think that you have to be the world's best caregiver. Just try to be the best that you can be, and be realistic about that. Another thing that I think, a practical thing that was advice that was given to me a long time ago, but that is helpful, is when you get into these situations where the shoe does drop and the meltdown happens, sometimes just changing location helps. Like, the two of you go out for a walk, or if you're farther along than that, the two of you go into another room, but somehow you change the location, and that sometimes can be enough to bump out of the meltdown groove and get things back into a little more even keel.
So I think we lost Jean, but I will move on to the next question. If Butch, I'm not sure if you're there, but Emily, I'm glad that your network is working. So this question comes in, and I think it kind of adds along to what you just said. Could you say more about reciprocity? I found that when I learned to see myself as the receiver of gifts from my husband, who had Lewy body dementia, as opposed to the giver, it made our lives so much more loving, from humor to profound statements to modeling how to live his last days. When I saw those things as a gift to me, my life as a caregiver became more tolerable.
Oh yeah, I think she's totally right. And looking for those gifts, because there are some days where you think this just plain stinks and there's nothing good about it. But then, you can say that about a lot of life. But then you look and you say, well, wait a minute, this was kind of a funny moment, or I am more empathetic perhaps, or I am more humble than I otherwise would have been if I had not become a caregiver. Those are good skills to learn. So yeah, don't just look at the dark side. There are some wonderful things that you can get from your loved one with dementia.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's like when you're really in a situation, it's easy to see things one way, but it's about maybe taking a step back and looking at things a little differently, from what I hear you saying, and changing.
Yeah, and I
changing.
mean, we laugh a lot and we say, that dementia is contagious, because I walk around the house trying to find things too, and I'm sometimes so grateful that I attached a little receiver device to every set of car keys, because then I'm not looking for them either. I can just, buzz my phone and the thing starts singing and I find them, and that's a gift right there.
Absolutely, that's so powerful. And there have been a lot of comments coming in that are similar and talking about how do you handle frustration, how do you handle moments of anger, but also what are other things to do besides seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist? And so the next question is, what about support groups? Are there any designated support groups for caregivers of loved ones with dementia? Butch or Emily?
I can respond if is my
Yep.
audio coming through?
Yes, it is.
I'm in a men's group, a men's support group, and I'm not the only one in the group that is a caregiver for somebody with dementia. And it has been very, very therapeutic. I think both of us have grown in our understanding of what's happening to us, and also maybe what's happening to the person that we love and we're caring for. It's informal, no holds barred, totally confidential, and it's a place where I feel like I can be me for a while. So yes to support groups.
I agree. And there are support groups for specific kinds of dementia.
Yes.
So when you have a diagnosis, it's very helpful. Shout out to the Alzheimer's Association. They have chapters in every major metropolis in the country and a lot of minor ones as well. And the other one for if you have a frontal lobe dementia, Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, which is theaftd.org, also has support groups around the country. They can also do them. The one that I occasionally get into is on Zoom right now, but hopefully we'd be able to get back together. And I don't go to every single one, but there are times when I think, yeah, that today's a good day for a support group. And another is if you acknowledge the disease out loud and let people know, then they can be there for you. And if you don't, then they can't help even if they wanted to. So acknowledge the disease, and then with people you know and love, also acknowledge your anger. I mean, that's totally fair. I used to laugh about those Kubler-Ross stages and say that we went around and around on all those, and I say we because we both did, around those Kubler-Ross stages, and mine got stuck on the anger cycle. I was just furious, and sometimes I still am, but that's okay. That's part of how you pick yourself up and get going again.
Amen.
Jean, do you have any last words since we're kind of nearing time?
I just hope that it has been useful to folks to know that, again, you're not alone in this, that the kind of grief that you've got as a dementia caregiver is unique and can be looked at through different lenses, and that it's there are ways to manage what you can manage. I'm going to share with you another bit of a poem from Denise Levertov. We started with her. This one is called Talking to Grief. Ah, grief. I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know that you've been living under my porch. You long for your real place. You need your name, your collar, your tag. You need to consider my house your own, and me your own person, and yourself my own dog. There are some resources I'd like to share if this can happen. Let's cross that off. Hope you can see this. I mentioned the book by Pauline Boss, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. I think it's a real go-to. If you're interested in a pastoral theologian's approach to dementia caregiving, Aileen's article has been in A Religion and Disability, and it's also online at academia.edu. Susan David, that psychologist, her talk I think is worth listening to. What's negative about positivity? Following that on the list is the Alzheimer's Association, their webpage on how to manage grief. It is good. And then I had to put in a plug for this book that will be coming out in the fall, Spiritual Companionship, basically for dementia caregivers, that we're calling Walking Each Other Home. Krishna, you've got some resources here too, don't you?
Yeah, on the next slide. And I just wanted to say that a chat came in that someone wants your book to hurry up and get published so they can get it sooner than later. I also wanted to say thank you to Emily and Butch. I think that this conversation was so helpful and everyone's experience is so valuable to the learning. And also wanted to say thank you to everyone who shared in the chat and the Q&A. Your comments and questions are so helpful in facilitating a conversation like this. And we just wanted to thank you for the courage to entering those in. So if you want to learn more, we have a course on dementia on cpg.org under the e-learning resources that you can take a look at. This webinar will be recorded and posted on cpg.org. So if you'd like to see it again or share it with someone, please feel free to do so. It's under the webinar series. And then the next third part of the series is on April 22nd. We'll be focusing on what is our hope. So we'll be ending this webinar, and immediately after that, you'll be getting a survey. Please take some time to finish that and send that back to us. And you'll be getting an email with the resources that Jean mentioned. Thank you again, everyone.